This stream is about to start. We'll talk about code or whatever we'll talk about today. It's about to start, so please hang tight while I check that everything is okay. Sound check, camera check, lights check. How's my hair? Oh, wait, I don't have any hair. Maybe put some pants on and I am good to go. So get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and let's write some code together, shall we? What we have on the menu today is to return to JSFX, to return to our real-time audio effects in REAPER, and to return to the problem of dealing with parameters. Oh no! If you're following these streams, you may be thinking, oh my god! I know. I feel the same. So here's what we are up to. We have been doing this library and this series of audio effects, and we learned that parameters appear in many places, and in most cases we dealt with the syncing and managing of these parameters in an ad hoc manner. And we are trying to find a principled way of doing things. We tried that for, I guess, 4 or 5 coding sessions maybe, and we haven't really reached a satisfactory solution. So today we will be doing more of that. Mage is here. Hey, great to have you here. And I guess he's having dinner with us today. So I thought about trying to continue the code that we were doing before, but it was not working so great. It was super complicated. And we spent some time away from it, and I remember that last time we worked on this code, it was not working very well. It was not reaching a unified and principled way of dealing with parameters. So we will revisit that code, but we will try to think things again, perhaps from scratch, in light of all the knowledge we gathered along the way. Bo is here as well. Hello, great to have you here. It's awesome that you're joining us. So, when I say that a parameter appears in multiple places, what I mean is, as a recap, oh no, there is already a syntax error in the program. Come on, line 22. Did we just leave? I think we just left the code in a state that doesn't even compile last time. Isn't that a whole lot of fun? I guess I will try and run the code with this simple change and see if that works. Okay, now it's compiling at least. A parameter is something like volume, attack, release, threshold, these sorts of controls on the user interface of the plugin. The parameter appears in many places, 4 at least that we care about. The first is this slider itself on the user interface, and if you have a custom user interface, you may hide these sliders, but you still want to have them and you still want to care about them because they will be, first of all, stored by default along with the REAPER project when you save the REAPER project, and then when you open that file, the sliders will be there. So you don't have to do any extra work to make sure that serialization and deserialization works. So that's the first reason. The second reason why you want these sliders is because of parameter automation, parameter modulation, and so on. So first place where parameters appear, the slider. Second place where parameters appear, I'm reading this off of my notes from last time. Derived parameters. For instance, here we have volume in dB, but we don't want to use, when doing audio processing, a volume in dB. We want to use that value in linear, so derived parameters. Third place is the graphics. If you have a custom user interface and you want to organize your sliders in different ways, or you want to do some fancy tapering of the scale, so if you have something like a frequency, you can devote more of the movement of the mouse to the part of the spectrum that matters more. So all of those things warrant a custom user interface. And if you have that, then that's a third place where your parameter is showing up. So if you change the slider here, you would like for this to change as well, and vice versa. You want this to be influencing one another or synced. Fourth place where a parameter may appear is if you have any sort of parameter that is linked across plugin instances, which is a whole can of worms. And I thought long and hard if it was really necessary to have this sort of thing. If there was any other way to link or to not need to link parameters. I couldn't think of anything. I really think that for something like an auto mixer, which is one of the effects we have been working on, I don't see any other way. I think that you really need to be able to link parameters, or worse, you need to have a side channel to communicate audio between plugin instances, but that's much more troublesome because of the syncing and lag of things. So all in all, this approach of linking sliders is not the best, but there is nothing better than it. And as you can see, I have two plugin instances that have the volume slider independent, but the attack slider is linked. So we have 4 places where parameters appear. Sliders, derived parameters like volume in linear, the graphics, and the side channel used by the plugin instances to communicate the linked parameters, which is the global memory, GMEM. Those are the 4 places. And then we have to consider at least 8 use cases, at least 8 workflows, like loading the plugin for the first time, loading the plugin from an existing REAPER project, and loading another plugin of the same type on a different track. So we have 8 of these workflows we have to think about. And that's what we're going to try to do today, sort of from scratch. We'll see how that goes. But we're saying back to audio coding. Yeah. So overall, the plan is I'm going to diversify a little. I do need to do the work on Kill the Newsletter, but I'm also interested in doing some audio stuff. And then there is some electronics that we will do along the way, perhaps some more music production. So yeah, we'll be spinning all the plates. The good side is that if you subscribe to the channel because you're interested in audio, if you subscribe because you're interested in live coding, if you subscribe because you're interested in electronics, there will be something for you. Maybe not every day, but there will be something for you almost every week. The downside is that because I am switching from project to project almost every day, it means that sometimes I have to do like what I'm doing right now, which is to get back into that context, which takes a bit of effort and a bit of time. But on the upside, it gives you some time, and especially gives me some time to rethink what I was doing and maybe consider different approaches, and that's usually good. Not always, but usually. Narrow is here. Hey, will you re-implement? Sorry, Narrow. It's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. Will you implement resampling in your JSFX framework? Probably yes. And maybe you're asking this. Hang on. When you say resampling, I suppose you mean upsampling and downsampling. So if you have a 44.1 kilohertz of a sampling rate, you would be able to oversample and then do some processing and then downsample. Or maybe, because resampling, in my head is something else. So maybe you mean oversampling and downsampling. And maybe you are asking that because I did a YouTube short recently. I have been experimenting with YouTube shorts, and I did this short explaining how to do oversampling. So perhaps that's why you are asking. And yes, I will do some sort of oversampling, downsampling in the library. As far as resampling, yeah, okay. You just confirmed that, yes, it is about oversampling. So we will do that. Probably the simpler approach first, where you just do the thing I explained in the short. You intersperse some samples that are just zero in the middle of your audio signal, and then you filter. And that's relatively straightforward to do. The only, I guess, challenging bit is the filter itself, but we have seen a good filter for this. Justin Johnson was over here on the stream a couple months ago, and he explained the oversampling filter that he used in REAPER, so we could use something like that. So we'll probably do something about this in the future. Not right now, because the automixer doesn't really need it, but we'll get to it when we need it. Can you talk a bit about the discrete Fourier transform as it relates to sample rate conversion? Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. As I mentioned in the end of that YouTube short in which I explained this technique for oversampling, I don't say it, but I put it on the screen. There are different ways of doing oversampling and downsampling. I think that the simplest way of doing it is this interspersing of zeros in your samples and then filtering. And that's what REAPER does, for instance. So it's actually useful. It's actually used in real plugins. But that's not the only way of doing oversampling and downsampling, as you may imagine. And there are different ways of doing this. One of the ways of doing this is with the Fourier transform. So the way it works is you take a chunk of samples, usually a power of 2, and you do, hang on, I have to remember this right. I think that it goes like this. I am 90% sure that it goes like this. You take a chunk of samples, say 1024 samples. You do the discrete Fourier transform of that. So you started with a signal in the time domain, you end up with a signal in the frequency domain with a magnitude and a phase, magnitude and phase. Then you fill in that buffer. So you started with 1024 samples, you end up with 1024 points in your frequency spectrum. You fill in that buffer with a bunch of zeros. So you see the relation, it's sort of similar. You're filling in with a bunch of zeros. So maybe you end up with a buffer of 2048 samples. The first 1000 are going to be a bunch of numbers that you computed using the DFT. The rest are going to be just a bunch of zeros. And then you take this bigger buffer of 2048 samples, and you do the inverse Fourier transform, going from the frequency domain back into the time domain. If you do all these steps I explained, you will end up with the signal that is the same as the original, but it will be composed of, in this case, 2 times as many samples. So you did 2 times oversampling. That's how it goes. And that's another way of doing oversampling that is sort of similar in the sense that you're filling a buffer with a bunch of zeros, but you're using this time you're using the DFT and the inverse DFT. So you're using the discrete Fourier transform and its inverse instead of a filter. Now, in terms of what should you be doing, which method is better, which one is faster, like Nero is asking, which one is faster? It depends. Depends on what you're doing. I think that for the most part, the method I explained in my short is probably faster, but I'm not sure because I haven't measured. But when you're doing the DFT, you have to you typically have to collect a bunch of samples and then do the DFT, but then you have to collect another bunch of samples. And typically you want these buffers of samples to overlap to some extent. Now, I'm not sure if it's necessary for oversampling, but if it is necessary for oversampling, if you have to overlap, then probably it's going to be slower. But I'm not sure. But it's kind of cool. And if you think about it, it is kind of intuitive that this works. So bear with me. Suppose that you're starting again with this signal in the time domain, 1024 samples, and you do the Fourier transform of that, the discrete Fourier transform in that case. And you end up with essentially the frequency spectrum of that signal, the kind of diagram you would see in a frequency spectrum analyzer. Now, the next step I explained, where you just fill in the buffer, you pad the buffer with a bunch of zeros. What you are doing is saying, okay, the signal had these frequencies in it, and it was band limited because it was at that lower sample rate, the original sample rate. But we know for a fact that because the signal was band limited, whatever energy there could be on these upper frequencies was zero. The signal was band limited to begin with. So we are asserting that these frequencies have no signal in them, have no energy in them. That's why you can pad with a bunch of zeros. But now, this bigger buffer of 2048 samples would be the result of the Fourier transform if you had a signal that was double the amount of samples and band limited in much the same way. So, at least to me, that makes intuitive sense, that if you take the inverse Fourier transform of that, you end up with the same signal, but with double the amount of samples. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that answers the question. I talked a bit about how the discrete Fourier transform can be used for sample rate conversion. Now, as to which method you should be using, you would have to experiment. I have not reached a case where I would need oversampling, so I have not done those experiments, have not gotten into that space that much. All I know is what I read and what I talked to people about, and haven't tried it myself. So you only know something for real when you try it for yourself. Bo is working on syncing the different slider parameters for EQ, for his EQ. Haven't found a good solution. Yeah. So it goes, such is life. We'll try to find something today. Sometimes all we need is a time off and get back to the problem. Okay, I'm glad that this made sense, Nero. Mage asks, how can someone so beautiful as a butterfly give me nightmares when it's part of DFT and FFT tutorials? Something. How can something so beautiful as a butterfly give me nightmares when it's part of DFT and FFT tutorials? If you try to implement the DFT, you can do that the long-handed way, like we did in the old stream I have on this channel. I implemented the DFT in the slow way. But if you try to implement the FFT, which is a method for computing the DFT which is faster, you end up with this concept of butterflies. Because if you draw the diagram of how the samples are computed and whatnot, it sort of looks like a butterfly. And FFTs are very complicated. I shouldn't say that. To make FFTs as performant as they can be, that is super complicated. To implement the DFT, it's relatively straightforward. We did it in 1 hour or something, and I don't think it worked first try, and then we fixed a little problem and then it worked. So overall, 2 streams and we were able to implement the DFT, including explanations of how it works. The FFT would probably take us a couple more hours, but it's not the end of the world. If you want it to be as performant as it can be, then you have to explore some tricky business in the processor. You have to do some sort of parallel processing. You have to use SIMD. It's complicated. It gets very complicated, and that's what Mage is alluding to here. Narrow is creating an Win32 wave player that can play arbitrary sample rates and bit depths. Interesting. So you mean that you are just reproducing files that have any sample rate or bit depth, or that you are able to manipulate the sample rate and bit depth of any audio as you are playing it? Because those are two different problems, and the first is complicated, the second is much more complicated. On the first, you have to probably just make sense of whatever you find in the file. If it has a weird sampling rate or bit depth, you may need to convert things to a sensible sample rate and then produce those samples. But yeah, you're saying that you want to manipulate them as they are playing. And then you get effects like bit crushers, and you can force aliasing to happen. So that's super interesting. And perhaps in your case, I think that would be for effect, right? You would do that because you want to hear weird, crazy sounds. So if you're doing that for effect, then you may prefer to not do, for instance, anti-aliasing filters when you're downsampling or upsampling. Because the purpose of the anti-aliasing filter is to prevent aliasing. But if you're doing this for effect, then maybe you do want aliasing, because that will color the sound in a digital, old school kind of way, which may be what you want. And that's interesting. Changing the bit depth is super straightforward. I'm not gonna say it's easy, but it's relatively straightforward, because all you have to do is a small formula that we sort of derived from scratch in one of my first streams about JSFX. And yeah, it wasn't even a stream back then because I didn't have the hardware to stream. It was just a video that I recorded in kind of a streaming style, but back then I didn't have the necessary gear to do an actual stream. But yeah, one of the first videos about JSFX on this channel is about a bit crusher, which is changing the bit depth in real time. And as long as you are not trying to dither and any of that, it's relatively straightforward to do. And again, if you're doing this for effect, I think that dithering may not be what you want, because that would try to mask the problems of lower bit depths. But if you are doing this because you want the effect, you don't want to you may not want to dither because you want the sonic artifacts. Anyway, Fortis is here. Hey, what's up, Fortis? Great to see you here. It's been almost half an hour and haven't even started. Oh my god. Let's try to get some code out. So, you know, previously this file was called test, and now I renamed it to template. So this is going to be the file that you use to start an effect when you're using the library that we have been developing. And yeah, we have some to-dos here that we may or may not address today, but let's go over what we care about and skip the rest. So this, I think, will need to be part of the template. Because well, I suppose maybe not, because for most effects you don't need linked parameters and you don't need GMEM in general. But it is good practice to have a name for GMEM if you are going to use GMEM. So I think I'm going to leave this on the template. Yeah. And then the sliders you have, and then import the library, and then on the init section, So I guess I'm taking the opportunity to not only look at the parameters, but also look at what we need in a template. And let's see the sections we have. So we have the init section, and I want to have all the sections in the template. And I think we have a slider section, and I think that we have, I'm gonna put this on the side, a block, sample, serialize, and GFX. Yes, we have all the sections in the template. Oh, don't be sorry. That's exactly why we do these things. I could write code on my own. It's much more interesting to be asked these kinds of questions and interact with you all. So don't be sorry. It's exactly what we are here for. That's exactly why I stream. So we have all the sections in the template. And I think that we need to have one entry point on each section in the library, because the library needs to intervene at the different points of the life cycle of the plugin. And the library needs a way of running some code in each of these sections. On the init section, we don't need anything explicit because we can just drop code. For instance, what we do here is the library. And check this out. We have 200 lines, almost 300 lines of comments and to-dos. Oh boy. And I bet, Nero, you were asking about oversampling. See? Has been here this whole time on the to-do list. In 2 places. Yeah, oversampling has been in the plan. We will get to it next year. Right, so I was showing how the library only has an init section. It doesn't have any other section. And that's because a library doesn't... the library code in other sections don't run. When you import a library, it will only run the init section. So the library only has an init section. And this is an example of code that is running on the init section in pretty much the same way that code would run here. And I think that it even runs before this code. Pretty sure that it runs before this code. So that's exactly what we need. Then for the next section, the slider section, I am fairly confident, not 100% sure, I'm fairly confident that this slider section does not need any hooks in the library. I don't think we need anything like _.slider. Well, we do have a function with that name, but it does a completely different thing. So I think that the slider function needs to exist in the template, because the slider function is going to do things that are related to these parameters. And in JSFX, we have very little in the way of abstracting over variables. We don't have a way, we sort of have a way, but it's kind of hacky, but we don't have a good way of dealing with this variable as a first-class citizen. We cannot pass this variable as an address somewhere and then manipulate the value of this variable. So I think that for the most part, we will just have to have code here in the template and ask people who use the template to see this and copy and paste. But I don't think that the library itself needs to do any work here on the slider section, because it always depends on the sliders you do have. And there is no good way for me to create an abstraction for this. Then the serialize section, it needs to exist, and it needs to maybe, I was going to say that it needs to be here, but maybe it could be a library function. Let's take a moment to check this. Or maybe check this again, because I vaguely remember checking this in the past. The reason why, and it says here, the reason why you must have a serialized section even if you don't do anything there is because the number of channels is not available on the init section if you don't have a serialized section. So let's test all of this again to see how it goes. So see hello is 0, meaning that the number of channels was unavailable on the init section. But if I have a serialized section that doesn't need to do anything, just needs to exist. And then hello is 2, which is the number of channels on this track. And the number of channels was available right in the init section. Great. Now, what happens if I import the library, but I don't have a serialized section? I think that hello will be 0. And it is. Now, let's try to have in the library a function that is pretty much anywhere, and it just says hello. And can I have a function that is completely empty? I don't think we can. Oh, and also having hello as the name here and hello as the name there. I was going to say it's a bad idea, but it's not, because I'm namespacing everything with underscore, so it's good. Let's try this and see if we can have an empty function. No, we cannot. So I will just copy that comment from here. It's not a comment, it's a string. And it's better to have something like this, I guess. It's better to have something like this as a comment because strings get allocated. So doing this with a string is not the best idea. Now we have a function. We go to the serialized section. And if we have a serialized section without any code in there, it doesn't work. The number of channels is still unavailable. Hello is still 0. But now what happens if I call the hello function? Good. So I will put in the template something like serialize. Yeah, awesome. It does not exist. I just put this in whatever location in the code, so I will change this later. And this is going to be the serialized section. It doesn't do anything. But it fixes the problem in a way that will be consistent and you don't have to have this comment here. And whatever, maybe later we will find in the library some reason to have a serialized section, some reason, something to put here. But now I say that this is consistent because other sections have these entry points into the library. All right. Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, tell us how it goes. And Andrea Zanini, probably mispronouncing your name. Sorry about that, but hello. It's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. All right. So the template is looking good so far. Almost every section starts with something like this, which is a way of telling library code, go ahead and do your thing. Great. On the sample section, we don't have that, but I think we need it. There are some things that we have been doing on the block section, like dealing with sliders. And because of sample accurate automation, we should not be doing that in the block section. We should be doing that in the sample section. So I think that we need an entry point like that. And this entry point needs to be as small and as fast as possible because this is running often. But I think it needs to exist. Now I changed this from these to these because I will have a... I don't think it exists yet. Yeah, it does not exist yet. Yeah, so there are some things we have been doing on the block section that we need to move here. And I did those things in the block section to begin with because I wanted to avoid some computation. I wanted to save some resources. And the block section runs much less often. But it turns out that there are some things you have to do in the sample section because of sample accurate automation. We'll get into that problem at some point. It's a to-do here. And then on this template, we also call the slider function here. And the reason why we call the slider function from the sample section is that the globally synced sliders that I showed before, there may be two instances of the plugin. One of these instances is moving a slider, updating the global memory, and that needs to be reflected into the second instance. So we need at some point to check that the global memory has changed. And that's what we are doing in the sample section with this. So we need to make sure that this function will check that. And it seems to be doing some of that over here. Right, awesome. So that's why this function is called here. Then the JSFX section also has a hook into the library. And here we do a lot of things. Not even gonna get into there because this function must be like 1,000 lines of code. See, never ends. Everything that has to do with the design system and everything is in here. Yeah, it's going from this line. So yeah, it's more than 1,000 lines of code. Most of these lines don't run on every frame though. We do have some way of checking that. Anyhow. And with that, we have all the sections. All the sections of code in JSFX are covered here, and we have all the hooks into the library that we will need. Excellent. Then we deal with user interaction, clicking the mouse on the custom user interface. So clicking and dragging here, for instance. We define an interactive area for that button. The interactive area is this abstraction in the library. Anything you see with an underscore in the beginning is part of the library. And this is an abstraction that detects mouse clicks, that detects click and drag and that sort of thing. Then we are updating that interactive area stage. So we are checking here. Did the person click? Did the person hold the button? Did the person move the mouse or something? So that's what we get here. And then we can probe this interactive area for the different states. For instance, if my mouse is on the area, it is hovering over the area, and I just pressed down, just press the button. So this is not the case that I'm holding the button. It's the case that I just pressed the button. It's an event. It's not a stage, so to speak. Yeah, it's defined like this. If the previous stage of the mouse was up and now is down, we emit this event. And if that's the case, we want to trigger slider automation so that you can come here and like create an envelope or an LFO for that. And here we are updating from the slider. Remember, there are 4 places in which a parameter appears. We are updating from the slider into this. We consider the slider to be the source of truth, and we are updating into the graphics notion of this parameter. Okay, that makes sense. Then next, we are checking if the area is active, and the area becomes active when you click and you start dragging, for instance, or really when you press down the mouse and you hold it down. That's what it means to be active. In that case, we update the internal notion of this slider. So this parameter here has this internal notion, the graphics notion, that goes between 5 and 6 in steps. So it can be at 5.5. Even if the slider is not, this internal notion can be in fractions, and we are updating that internal notion. The internal notion is what is prefixed by JSFX. And something that I learned recently when I was talking to Toucan, John Matthews from Toucan Studios, is that you have to take in account whether or not you are in a retina display when dealing with this. Because what I'm doing here is I am checking the mouse cursor over time, and I am changing the value of the slider according to the movement as long as the area is active. So if you are holding down the button and you start dragging, your dragging, which is a distance in pixels, gets translated to a value in dB, and that updates the slider. But what I learned from him is that this value in pixels depends on whether you are on a retina display. So I suppose I should embed this notion in the library. And again, this is part of the big JSFX function that we saw before. And I guess we have this difference on the x-axis and this difference on the y-axis. And I think that what we want to do is to multiply by JSFX x retina. Yes. And what this will do is to take in account whether you are in a retina display when computing this difference. And this difference will be used here to change the internal notion of this slider. If all of this requires too much context, and if you're trying to follow this and you're not following this, then please ask questions on the chat, because I'm happy to re-explain some of these things if you're joining us now. I realize that we are very in the weeds with this. We're like 10 levels deep. You have to have been watching this for a long time to actually make sense of some of this. So if you want to ask questions, please do. Anyhow, we are computing this, we are translating this value in pixels into a value in dB using this factor. And this is a number that we have to calibrate. And now that we are taking in account whether or not you are in a retina display, I think that this calibration will be thrown off. Let's test the plugin and see how it behaves. It actually feels nice. It feels nicer than before. So I think that we have a good number here. And not only that, if this was not a retina display, it would behave in much the same way. I would need to move my mouse about the same distance on my desk to cause the same movement in dB, which is a problem, for instance, in the existing version of the Toucan Studio, unless he has updated. I don't know. But he was working on this. So if you click and drag on a retina display, it moves much faster than on a non-retina display. And it was calibrated for non-retina, so it is moving about double the speed it should. There is no right answer for this. There is no should, but it's moving about double the distance or double the speed it was intended to. So I guess now we have taken care of that in the library. And as much as we can, we want to take care of things in the library so we can forget about them. Right, and then we do this, which is to make sure that it's following the same steps as this control. No, not really. It's not following the same steps as this. Why do we do this like that? Oh, I guess it makes sense. If I hold Command, then I can go in finer steps. Good. And I suppose that here I have to give this step finer grain of granularity because I cannot hold Command to fine-tune this, but I can hold Command to fine-tune that. I'm playing around with some of the behavior here that I think we may want to reproduce, which is sort of cool, actually. Yeah, let's take note of this. If I'm holding Option, and when I hold Option and I click and drag, if I release the mouse cursor while I'm holding Option, it snaps back. And if I release, I'm holding Option right now, but if I release Option first, and then I release the mouse, it stays there. So it's a good way of you auditioning something, see if you like that something. If you like it, then release Option and then the mouse cursor. If you don't like it, release the mouse cursor while holding Option and it will snap back, which may be even useful in performance or something. So yeah, I want to have that. As much as possible, I'm trying to reproduce the behavior of actual sliders in Reaper, like this does that with Option. And this does Command to fine-tune. This does the Option thing. It does not do Command to fine-tune. But weirdly enough, if I click and drag, then my mouse cursor is showing. And when I hold Command, it stops showing. But the level of granularity is still the same. I don't get any fine-tuning. If anything, it feels faster on this one. I guess the only difference is that the cursor goes away. And also when I release Command, it snaps back in a weird way. I don't like that behavior. I don't think it's useful and it's not consistent with the rest of the Reaper interface. Yeah, if anything, it's going faster. I don't like that. I think I'm going to reproduce this behavior, not this one. Let's see what you all have to say. Mage is asking, can you get away with having a serialized section in the library only to trigger the setting on the channel count? Yeah, that's a good question. I will test this. I think that the answer is negative, but I want to make sure. As I said, I think that in the library, when you are using the library, when you are importing the library like that, JSFX will ignore any section that is not the init section, but we can try. That's the test, right? You have a serialized section in the library and you don't have a serialized section in the code that is imported in the library. And hello will be 0 if I am right, and it will be 2 if I am wrong. And if I am wrong, then we may not need this entry point. Oh, interesting. Hello is 2. So this means that I am wrong. Let's review to see if there is anything that I may be missing. Let's make sure that this is really what is making things work. Yeah, hello is 0. And when the library has a serialized section, hello is 2. JSFX is bonkers. Thanks, Mage. That was a great idea. So with that, we don't need this. We don't need it, but we don't need it, and it's less code. But since this is the template, I'm sort of tempted to leave this here, because in the future, if we ever find something to do with the serialized section, then it's already hooked. I really like this though. I didn't know it worked that way. But I think I'm going to leave it like this because it matches better what's happening on the other sections. But yeah, you have a good point. We'll see about that. Yeah, thanks for suggesting that. JSFX is bonkers. What's next? This is what happens when you double click. And there is something that should not, but it bothers me so much that we have to update these two variables. But I guess it kind of matches what happens here, so that I guess I'm okay with that. Yeah, I guess I'll just let it be. So I like everything that I see here. Then I suppose that the second slider is going to be exactly the same. I think I was consistent on that. Define an interactive area, update the interactive area. When you hover, slider automate, and copy from the slider notion of a variable into the GFX notion of the same variable. When it's active, because we solved this issue in the library, the issue of retina displays, we solved it in the library, this got picked up as well. So the attack should behave in a way that is sensible. Let's see. Feels okay. And then double clicking should reset. And what happens when I double click and drag? It works. Awesome. And then I call the slider function again, because the value of the slider may have changed from the GFX section, so we need to update stuff, compute derived parameters and whatnot. And also this marks the separation from I am done dealing with user interaction, done dealing with the mouse. I'm about to start drawing. And I have nothing to say about the drawing. All that looks sensible to me. So the only thing missing is the init section. We have to do these lines. We have to go over these lines to see if they make sense. Mage is saying, scaling is a problem. The experimental UI scaling in Reaper preferences has various issues. Interesting. You're probably saying that in reference to the Retina display and whatnot. I know that when you set GFX X Retina to 1, like we did here, when you do that, this variable becomes either 1 if your display is not Retina, or 2 if your display is Retina, which is a convenient number because you can just multiply this variable by whatever amount you are dealing with, amount in pixels. And this also enables Retina support. So we use this variable all over the place as a multiplication factor. And that's how we are dealing with Retina displays. But it is true that user interface the Reaper user interface can be scaled in different ways, and on Windows you can even scale the whole system in different ways. It's not possible in macOS as far as I can tell. You can only control the resolution, but you cannot control the scaling of the user interface of the operating system. But yeah, I think that all I can do from the JSFX perspective is set this variable and use it. But let me know if there's more that I can do in JSFX, or if there is something that breaks, something that you know to be broken when it comes to scaling. JSFX is bonkers. I just discovered a Reaper extension called ReaLim. You all aware of this? It allows low latency monitoring similar to Cubase and Logic. I do not know about this. Oh, I guess it's not LIM, it's LLM. I don't remember having problems with monitoring. And I'm not sure I know what... I have never used Cubase, but I have used Logic, and I'm not sure I know what low latency monitoring mode is in Logic. Can you explain this a bit more? Okay, yeah. So Fotis is going to explain this a bit more on Discord, and then you all can go to the link in the description, go to my website. From there you can go to the Discord server where we hang out. Yeah, I will look into this. Saved for later. Okay, let's take a couple minutes to look at these lines. This time precise thing, I don't think I will be using. Yeah, I think that I will be using a different strategy here. And this updated edge, I don't think I will be using either. These lines are defining addresses in memory for the global parameter that will be linked across plugin instances. And I think I'm going to refer to this. I think I remember thinking about this problem, and I think we'll find a good solution just by having one flag to say if the global memory has been initialized. We'll see about that. But these are addresses, these are locations in the global memory, and the global memory is just a big chunk of memory visible by every plugin instance that has the same identifier. I wonder if there are other options we should set here. If I go to my auto mixer, the work in progress version, the only option is this. Okay. Okay, so this is starting this volume db previous variable. Yeah, one thing that we learned the hard way, but is a fact, is that we need to be able to tell in the slider function when we are computing derived parameters and whatnot, we need to be able to tell which variable changed, because we don't want to recompute derived parameters that may be expensive depending on what kind of derived parameters we are talking about. So for instance, if you have a filter and you can change the cutoff frequency of the filter, that is done by recomputing some internal coefficients of the filter. And I don't want to keep doing that work if all you're doing is just change the volume on the output of the effect. So in other words, we want to be able to tell which parameter has changed, and to do that, we need to keep track of the previous values of every parameter. And to begin with, this will be undefined because it will force this to compute the derived parameters. That sounds about right. Then here we are checking if the global memory has been initialized. If it has been initialized, then the value of this if the global memory has been initialized, we probably want to run this line, and if it has not, we want to run this line. If the global memory has been initialized, well, I guess chronologically things work the other way. Probably that's why I had the lines in this order. So if it has not been initialized, that's the first thing that is going to happen when the first plugin loads. We just say that this previous value is undefined, much in the same way that we did here. But if the global memory has been initialized, then we do this. That does not seem right to me. What seems right to me is to do that. So I will do that, and then later we'll see things breaking. Or maybe not. Maybe this is the right answer. Yeah, so the intent here with this part is I am setting a flag to tell me if the global namespace that is used to communicate between plugin instances, if that has been initialized or not. If it has been initialized, that's the source of truth. And if it has not been initialized, this plugin is the source of truth. So we only have one parameter that is linked. That's this. And that's its address in memory, in the global memory. And then I initialized every slider previous to undefined. That will force recomputation further down the line. And the previous value is just the notion of these variables, but from one run ago, so to speak. And they start undefined. So far this looks good, and this is pretty good indication when you're reading the code that this is a linked parameter. So I like the way this reads. And then we have this updated add thing, which I'm trying to get rid of. And this is the function that runs in many contexts. It runs right when the plugin loads, because the slider section runs, and then this will be called. It also runs almost every, it runs on every sample, and it even runs on the JSFX section. So it runs everywhere. This function is where it's at. We'll get to that right now. So this is the slider that is not linked. All we got to do is check if this is the case, if this holds. In other words, if the slider has been changed, and then compute the derived parameters. And this derived parameter is not even used anywhere in the plugin. It is just here for show. But that's what the template is for. And then we update that notion. Good. Then we get to the tricky business, the parameter that is linked. To begin with, we just do the same. We check if it has been changed. And then we gotta compute the derived parameters. Here, I'm changing this because I'm conceptualizing about this again from scratch, but I'm changing this in a way that will just mimic that. So we are not dealing with the linking so far. We compute a derived parameter and we update the previous state for the next time we go around. I think that then another thing that we need to do is to update the global memory using this value. I think I remember the problems in doing that, but I think that this is a good start. And this we don't want anymore. Oh, I forgot a crucial line. I now initialized the memory, so I will set it to true. The global memory, I initialized it. Well, not really, but I will initialize it right after I run this function, so I might as well just set this to true. The only problem is a race condition between multiple plugins running at once. Well, I could call the slider function here. Though it is kind of silly because it will be called again, but then we can set this variable right when it is true. I think that something like this makes sense. You start by computing derived parameters if necessary, and if it is necessary to compute derived parameters, it means that we are ready to update the global memory, and then we do. But at the end, we update ourselves with respect to the global memory. So this may have updated the global memory, and then this will read from the global memory right after, which is kind of silly. But for the most part, this will be just reading from the global memory. The problem is that if we read from global memory and detect that we need an update for the derived parameters, we will only do that on the next time around. So this will be one sample off in terms of sample accurate automation. We probably want to reorganize this to avoid that. But we could reason about all the edge cases to see if we covered all of them, all the workflows, load the plugin for the first time, load the plugin from a REAPER project, and blah, 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 and see if this solution fixes all the issues, if it addresses all the workflows. Perhaps that's what we'll do. Okay, Mage says, option gmem blah probably needs a comment to say that LIAFAC template needs changing to be unique to the communicating. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, this needs to be documented, and a lot of other things need to be documented. So you're talking about comments, which is part of documentation, and I agree. I think that this needs a whole lot of documentation. The whole library needs a whole lot of documentation. But that's not what I'm going to try and do today on this pass. I'm going to try to get things to work, and the last thing I will do is documentation. And I know sometimes it's better to start with documentation. Sometimes it's better to do documentation later. In this project, I'm going to do documentation a bit later. So I get your point. It makes sense. I think it's part of documentation. It will be done later. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up. So yeah, we haven't made a lot of progress, but we have gotten ourselves back into this stage. It's pretty much like what we did yesterday with Kill the Newsletter. It was just getting back into that mindset. And next time we will test this, I will probably try and do some tests before we start the next section, because I want to be more confident that this is either working or more confident in the ideas we need to implement for next time. But I wanted to get this mindset back, since we didn't work on this for 1 or 2 weeks at this point. And tomorrow, perhaps we'll be doing Kill the Newsletter. Why not? So tomorrow we'll be doing web programming. We'll be doing Kill the Newsletter, and we may get back to this on Thursday. We'll see. Make sure you tune in and you will see what the title of this stream is. So for the time being, thank you to Mage, Fotis, Andrea, and Nero, and Bo for joining me on the chat. Thank you to everyone else who is watching this, and make sure you go to PayPal and Patreon and support me and subscribe and blah, blah, blah. Before I go, great stream, more circular thinking about GMEM that always falls between my fingers like grains of sand. Yeah, GMEM is complicated. Anyway, I see you tomorrow for some more web programming. Thank you all for being here. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for watching the stream. You know how great it has been. Or maybe it sucked, and I am glad that you stuck with me. And soon we'll all be back together for some more coding or talking or chilling. The next time I'll be streaming.